Hello, good afternoon, and welcome. A happy World Town Planning Day to you all. I think this is the 75th anniversary, so welcome. We'll be giving you an hour and a half our webinar and lively discussion on meeting rural challenges in Norway and Scotland, housing services and sustainability with a focus on second homes, their impact on local rural housing markets and innovative responses to addressing the challenge. I'm Julia Frost, RTPI Scotland International Group Chair and Planning Director at SHP Planning Consultancy. I was convener for RTPI Scotland in 2019, and for almost 30 years now I've worked across all planning sectors, private, local authority, national government, third sector, and I'll be your chair today. Now some juicy facts to get the conversation started. Norway population, very, very similar to Scotland. The Norwegian area, however, is dramatically different. Norway is much, much larger area. The population, the percentage of agricultural land, much less. Scotland has a much higher percentage of agricultural land. Norway is a much richer country in terms of gross domestic product. Oil production, much more effective. But interestingly, in terms of the number of second homes, Norway has a hugely higher number. Although conversely, in terms of short-term lets, Scotland has much more of them compared to Norway. So some interesting facts there for you, just comparing the two countries, just to get us started in those pictures. Top one, Norway, bottom one, Scotland. Some other facts here. So Norway has a huge number of local authorities, 356 local authorities with full planning powers. The average size of each local authority is only 15,000 inhabitants. Scotland has 32 local authorities, so far less, with full planning powers and much larger. So those plans you see there just illustrate the differences in sizes. Norway probably has the most decentralized political and planning system in Europe. It's always been national policy in Norway. And this means that rural planning authorities have very extensive planning powers and very limited technical and planning capabilities, sometimes because they haven't got the staff, really. Unlike in Scotland, almost no land in Norway is owned by foreigners, and this has an impact on both urban and rural development. So just some facts there just to get the conversation started. I should say, just going back to this first plan here, you can see the close proximity between Scotland and Norway just across the North Sea there. In terms of the agenda, so we'll be focusing on second homes, their impact on local rural housing markets and innovative responses to addressing the challenge. Norway presentation will start first, focusing on mountains, coast towns, and a term known as botlit, which its literal translation is duty of occupation, and more on that from Ellen soon. And in terms of Scotland, there's a case study looking at Morven, community-led crofting case study, and Paul Eade and Sam Firth will be speaking there. Just to give you a wee bit of summary as to who they are. So Ellen Coates, so she'll give the Norwegian perspective. Ellen's British, started her career as a chartered town planner in Scotland. She has a range of experience from the public and private sectors with a particular focus on infrastructure delivery. Since 2018, she's actually been based in Oslo, specialising in transport planning. And Ellen's particularly keen to explore the synergies between the two planning systems in Norway and Scotland. Gunnar Ridderstrom is a Norwegian architect, and he's worked with Ellen in preparing her presentation. Gunnar has experience working with municipal government, regional government, and the Norwegian Public Roads Administration at all levels of Norwegian planning system. His subject matter expert is Urban Development Department at Norconsult AS, and he serves as Associate Professor at the Department for Urban and Regional Planning at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences. Giving the Scottish perspective is Paul Eade. He's a town planner and he's founder and principal at Place at the Table. He is specialising in project management and delivery of community action plans and planning local place plans at the moment alongside community groups in Scotland. He has many years' experience as a volunteer community leader, community development worker, planning case officer in a local authority and trainer. And then Sam will present alongside Paul. Sam's a filmmaker and crofter living on the west coast of Scotland. She's won awards for her filmmaking as well as delivering participatory filmmaking projects across the Highlands of Scotland, working with a number of community development trusts and living in Neudark for 7 years, which is a peninsula in Scotland, community owned and managed. So our speakers will take you on a journey from the big national picture to practical case studies examples and explore what we can learn from both Scotland and Norway to help address both housing need and our rural areas to thrive. There'll be questions that I pose at the end. There'll be questions throughout. So firstly, just a bit of housekeeping. We'll be recording the session. We're keen to make the session as interactive as possible, so encourage you to submit questions throughout. We'll be answering questions at the end. So any questions, please put them in the Q&A box, which I'll be monitoring. Great to see so many people tuned into the webinar today. I think we've got over 150 sign-ups, which is great. So without further ado, I'm just going to pass you on to Ellen. Ellen, over to you.
Hi, thanks, Julia. As Julia said, I've been a practicing town planner in both Scotland in the UK and Norway. So I was really excited to be invited to take part in the discussions with the international group on this. We've had some really interesting discussions, I would say, about the synergies and differences between the two countries and the different challenges that we face. So my presentation is a bit of a summary, really, of some of the discussions we've had with inputs from Gunnar and Mike Fergus as well. So just to start off, I thought I'd give you a bit more of the background and the context to Norway here. We have a population of my slides just disappeared from the screen there. We have a population of 5 million, 5.5 million in Norway, and we have approximately 500,000 second homes, which is quite a startling figure when you think about it. The map here shows the 15 fylkeskommuner, or regions, administrative regions or counties, and we have 357 kommuner, or local authorities, municipalities. What I think is important is that we have a really large variation in the number of local authorities per region, in the land area and population between the regions, within the regions, and within the different local authorities. So you see there, I've listed up some of the smallest. So we have Utsira with a population of 215 compared to Oslo with a population of over 700,000. And similarly, in terms of land area, we go from some of the island communities with a land area of just over 6 square kilometres compared to up in the north, significantly larger areas. And I think what's important to note with that is that it's the same legislative and regulatory context and framework that applies to all these different local authorities, regardless of size. So it has to be usable in all sorts of different contexts. Little bit more on the geography and economy and so on. Julia's already mentioned differences in GDP. This means that Norwegians tend to have a great amount of disposable income to use on leisure activities, second homes, amongst other things. Primary industries in Norway: oil, fishing and aquaculture, and the Norwegian Oil Fund is also really important to mention here. the government is permitted to spend 3% of the money from the oil fund it use it 3% in its budget, and that's because if they used more, it would have unwanted in inflationary effects. So it's just really to put that into perspective a little bit. Norway has a really significant land area, but if you look at the actual land classification, you can see that a significant amount of the country is open lands, countryside, or natural forest. So built up areas only account for 2% and farmland around 4%. I think it's important to mention as well the cultural context, and friluftsliv, or the outdoor life, is a really central element of the Norwegian culture. People regularly use their weekends, holidays to go swimming in the lakes, walking in the forests or mountains, or skiing. And compared to other European countries, Norwegians experience a really strong they experience really strong ties to the land, strong bonds. We discussed this a little bit in the group, and we figured out that Norwegians are perhaps 3 generations away from farming backgrounds, compared to it's probably more like 6 generations in the UK or in Scotland. It's also important to note that the right of access is established in the Outdoor Recreation Act in Norway, and this means that people have the right to access uncultivated land all year round on foot, and also to camp in rural areas. They have the right to swim in the sea or inland waters, and young people under 16s have the right to fish for free as well. So it just illustrates again this cultural context and the importance of outdoor recreation in Norway. Very briefly on the planning framework. The planning system in Norway is governed by the Planning and Building Act, and there are essentially 3 tiers of land use planning. At a national level, we have the legal framework, the Planning and Building Act, and so national guidelines, national expectations as well. And then at the regional level, we have regional authorities, or fylkeskommuner. We have a series of regional plans and strategies, which are also in relation to land use planning. But the main land use authority is the local authority, so down to the council level or kommune level. They're responsible for local plans, and looking at planning applications, and decisions about local plans and planning applications. They are taken by elected councillors in the planning committee, and then ratified by full council. So there's a really decentralised form of decision making when it comes to land use planning, particularly when you think about the large number of local authorities. As we've said, 357 in Norway. The other important point to note is that at a national level, Norway has what's called distriktspolitikk, which is districts policy, translates to, which essentially states that irrespective of where you are in the country, people have the right to lead a good life. And that means that there should be room for development, there should be decent services, access to work and housing across all parts of the country, regardless of how remote they are. So this gives quite a pro-development backdrop to planning in more rural areas. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the housing challenges associated with second homes. Now, as I've mentioned, Norway has around 500,000 second homes across the country, and I think we can note there are two things about second homes which are interesting takeaways. The first is that these tend to be privately owned cottages or cabins for personal use. As Julia mentioned, we don't have the same market for short-term holiday lets. The second important point when it comes to land use planning is that holiday homes have their own use class. So it's just something to bear in mind as we go further with the talk. So first off, cabins in the mountain. Traditionally, cabins have been associated with pastoral farming practices and were often really primitive, often without running water, often without electricity. And although there are some cabins that are still like that today, used as holiday homes in particular, most of the new cabins that are being built, in fact, pretty much all of the new cabins that are being built and a lot of the older ones that have been renovated and so on, fully serviced and just as well equipped as permanent homes. So it's not perhaps quite like the picture on the left there. Now, the high demand for cabins and the relative pro-development stance in rural areas has meant that in the most popular areas, so within reasonable driving distance of Oslo, for example, other large built-up areas, we're increasingly seeing large estates of cabins. And the aerial photo here just shows part of the Trysil cabin development, which is a really popular place for skiing in the winter. And you can see the density here, although they are relatively spread out, it's having quite a marked impact on the landscape. And a few more statistics here. In 2021, permission for commencement of development was given to more cabins or holiday homes than permanent homes in 119 out of the 357 local authorities. Now, in the same year, there were actually more cabins than permanent homes in 47 of the local authorities in Norway. I think that's pretty remarkable when you think about it. Now, given the strong cabin culture and the relative abundance of land, the cabin building industry has largely gone unfettered, I would say, but it's also been considered as a really important tool for local economic growth in areas with few other industries. So in many ways, you could argue that it's supporting this idea of district policy, generating income in areas with few other options. But in recent years, there's been increasing discussion about how sustainable this actually is and about the negative impacts associated with these developments. One of the important things I think to note as well is that when it comes to large cabin developments in rural areas, it can actually be more lucrative for builders to build cabins than permanent homes. And this means that it in itself can contribute to a shortage of skills, building materials in rural areas, making it difficult to house permanent residents. So I'd like to share a short case study on a place called Norefjell, which you can see on the map here, lies a couple of hours away in terms of driving from Oslo. It's a mountainous area, and I think there are 5 local authorities, local councils that partly cover this area. It's also a really important area for wild reindeer and is of high environmental value. Yeah, in this area, we've got 7,500 cabins. The stats are from 2022, and there's been significant growth in recent years as well. A significant amount of land has been designated for this type of development in the local plans. But in response to concerns about sustainability, it was actually the regional council at the time, Viken Fylkeskommune, who commissioned a study to look at the socioeconomic impacts of this type of development. The study itself comprised a socioeconomic analysis of 3 different building scenarios, and it used a simplified model to assess economic impacts associated with the land purchase, plot preparation, cabin building in the development phase, what happened in the maintenance and operational phases, and then in terms of use after completion, including things like council taxes, utilities, and so on. They also attributed values to other aspects such as impacts on nature, environmental quality, cultural heritage, and other common benefits, for example, that land is available for recreational use. And they did that using a series of surveys with local residents and a bit further afield as well, asking essentially how much people would be willing to pay to reduce the number of cabin developments given a certain set of impacts and consequences. And I think what's interesting here is that they found that at a local level, in very simplified terms, each cabin was found to generate about 7,000 kroner in annual property tax. So that's per cabin per year. Now, not all of the economic impacts are positive for the local authorities either. In accordance with the Health and Care Act, each local authority has a duty to provide healthcare and care services for all of its inhabitants, including those who are there on holiday or at their holiday cottages. So it means that they have to have a certain level of infrastructure, even though the number of permanent residents is perhaps not as high as otherwise. So this caused quite a headache during COVID, as you could imagine. But it's another factor that's taken into account in this assessment here. But what they did find was that the net gain for the local authority per cabin would be around 4,000 kroner per year. Now, at a local level, they found that cabin development was socioeconomically advantageous, unsurprisingly, given the significant amount of money that's generated at a local level by these developments, and despite the environmental costs. But when they looked at the national level, they found that the picture was quite different, and it was these types of developments were found to actually be socioeconomically detrimental when they occur at such a large scale. So there's really quite an interesting balance there between the local and national interests. Yeah. Now, the study went on to look at different recommendations to improve sustainability and to reduce the negative impacts associated with this loss of a finite resource. One of the perhaps the most obvious means of improving sustainability is to limit, in fact, the rate and the extent of cabin developments. And the local planning system, the local plan provides a really simple and direct means of achieving this. But what's interesting is that although we have the tools to deal with it in terms of the planning system, it's how we change the policy and the decision-making process and practices at a local level so that they reflect the national challenge as well. The state has traditionally been very reluctant to get involved in local planning matters. Norway has a very decentralised system, but when you have issues like this, where there's quite a clear difference in the benefits between a local and national level, you can ask a question as to how, whether we achieve the right balance or not, given that it's such a decentralised system. So I think it's also really interesting that the report suggested a whole raft of other measures which can be used to try and improve sustainability. For example, tax on building in areas of higher environmental value, incentives or compensation for the designation of protected areas, and earmarked contributions to local authorities for work which secures national values. So the very fact that they're thinking about taxes and other incentives instead of using the planning system, I think, is really interesting. Now, I'd like to move on and look at a slightly different challenge as well, which is perhaps more recognisable in many other countries, and that's holiday cottages along the coastline. As in many other places, the south coast of Norway is really popular as a location for holiday homes, which creates a number of challenges in terms of the local housing markets, driving up prices and making it difficult for local people to afford permanent residential properties, which in turn makes it difficult to attract people to work in the tourism industry, amongst other things. Now, on top of this, in Norway, you've also got this very strong friluftsliv culture, outdoor culture, and access to water and to the sea for recreational purposes is very important. So development along the coastal zone is also seen as a threat to that. Now, given that it's been recognised as a national resource for many, many years, there are actually measures in place in the Planning and Building Act to try and protect the coastal zone. And we have what's called the 100-metre rule, which is set out in the legislation, which essentially means that it's forbidden to build within 100 metres of the shoreline. I think that's measured from the high tides mark. That was first introduced around Oslofjord as long ago as 1956, I think it was. So it's a pretty well established part of the legal framework. Now, there are some exceptions where the local council can they can approve different building boundaries, but there's a really strong expectation at a national level that the 100-metre rule will be upheld. So that's in quite stark contrast to the extent to which the state wants to get involved in planning issues when it comes to cabins in the mountain, for example. The downside of the 100-metre rule is that it's actually put even greater pressure on existing properties. So there's more pressure than ever for existing properties to be used as holiday homes, which in itself just contributes to the housing crisis. Now, there's another tool which Julia mentioned in the introduction, which we have, which is also a legislative tool, and that's called boplikt, or a duty of occupation that can be applied to residential properties. It's a rule that's established in the Concessions Act, which essentially states that property can't be acquired without the permission of the king, but it's obviously a delegated power now. And it means that where concession is required, then a duty of occupation can be applied. Now, there are loads of exemptions to the rules. Oops, I see the slides disappeared again. But these exemptions can be removed by way of secondary legislation, and it's up to each local authority to decide whether or not to introduce these regulations. And there are currently 41 local authorities of the 357 where there's secondary legislation in place regarding a duty of occupation. Now, this legal framework effectively provides a mechanism of controlling which residential properties can be used as holiday homes and which properties must be used as permanent homes. And if the duty of occupation is not fulfilled or not upheld, then people can ultimately be forced to sell the property. So there are quite extreme consequences. Now, I'm not a legal expert on Boelplicht by any means, but as I understand it, factors such as whether it's necessary to prevent the property from being used as a permanent dwelling will be taken into account when the requirement for duty of occupation is being considered. The location, the type, the condition of the property, the area's character, how long ago the property was used as a permanent dwelling and for how long, and the likelihood that a property can be sold as a permanent dwelling. These are all factors that come into play in relation to this duty of occupation. So, how effective is this in practice? To what extent does Boelplicht actually function? People in Norway have both the ability and the willingness to pay for properties, to pay a premium for properties along the coastline. As I've said, the south of Norway is a really attractive place in the summer. We have a low tidal range. The waters are really sheltered given the series of islands, small islands along the coastline. So it's very popular to have small boats, and those properties which have direct access to the water or private moorings, they really do come at a premium. So although the duty of occupation goes some way to addressing the housing crisis, in fact, combined with the 100-metre rule as well, it is skewing the housing market even further and creating really extreme differences in property prices between those which can be used as second homes and those which need to be used as permanent homes. And given that those differences exist, it means that people are always looking for innovative ways to get around the rules, essentially. One of them being rent a southerner, rent your property out to locals for the best part of the year, but then use the property as a holiday home in the summer months. So it's, I would say that these legislative tools, they do function, but they don't come problem free. So just to round off, I've listed up a couple of points which might be useful to think a little bit about as we go further with the discussion and listen to the next talk. And that's the influence that second home ownership can have on local housing markets, creating local housing crises in popular rural areas and coastal areas. There's this interplay between the state and the local planning authority. To what extent is a very decentralized planning system a positive thing? Is it able to cope with the national challenges, or will it mean that decision making is skewed to benefit the local level? And how do we define this issue of sustainability? It has many different arms and branches. It's a difficult question to answer. It comes up all the time. Are we thinking about social capital? Are we thinking about environmental sustainability? How do we prioritize these when it comes to the challenges with the housing market in rural areas. So that's pretty much all I had to say. I hope that was of interest for everybody, and hopefully we'll get some good discussion going at the end there.
Okay, thank you very, very much, Ellen. Really interesting. One thing I really took from that was that Norwegians have the right to lead a good life. So I think that should be something that we should all aspire to. So thank you very much. Thank you for your key points there, and we'll come back to them at the end. I'm just going to pass on to Paul now to give the Scottish perspective. So over to you, Paul.
Excellent. Thank you, Julia, and thank you, Ellen, for that excellent presentation. Myself and my colleague Sam Firth are going to be doing the next part of this presentation. We're going to be talking about rural housing in Scotland, the fact that we have a housing crisis in our rural areas, particularly along the coasts and in popular areas, as is the same in Norway. And we're going to talk about a positive community-led response to this as a case study. So Sam is with Morven Community Woodlands, and I'm with Place at the Table, my company. By way of introduction, this rural housing crisis is significant. It's been long-lasting, and it is considered that it will continue for a long time yet. Is a lot of work going on behind the scenes to try and address it. In 2024, just this year, the Highland Housing Challenge Summit has emphasised the need to develop a culture of delivery, and the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations Rural and Islander Housing Association conference in Dundee has raised the really important question of how critical this issue in terms of housing key workers for rural areas of Scotland, doctors, nurses, and key infrastructure workers. And so the Scottish Futures Trust is working to develop new delivery models, of which one may be a crofting, which is an older Scottish model that we'll talk about soon. Anyway, this actually impacts Norwegian state interests, because Statkraft, the energy developer, the renewable energy developer owned by the Norwegian state, operates in Scotland and is bringing forward a significant amount of wind turbine developments. But in order to build the energy transmission infrastructure as well as the wind farms themselves, we need to find rural housing for key workers, a significant number, thousands of people over the next few years. If we can't find those homes, it's going to be very difficult to build those that infrastructure, and there will be less revenue potentially coming to Statkraft and the Norwegian state. Just thought I'd make that link. So the scale of the challenge is huge. Scottish Land and Estates, which is an umbrella body for rural housing providers who provide up to 13,000 affordable homes for rent in rural Scotland, said that although its members are fully committed to the challenges, it is indeed a formidable task that faces us. So I want to talk a little bit about the Scottish and rural context, the housing crisis, and our current planning responses. I want to be able to, with Sam's help, examine crofting as a mechanism of delivery of rural housing, not just other tenure types. And I want to explore a case study of a community-led project to do just this in Morven, in the west coast of Scotland. And I want to explore this idea of duty of occupation as a regulatory response to shape rural housing markets. Crofting has a duty of occupation not dissimilar to some of the concepts we've just heard about in Norway, but no other rural tenure housing type has any kind of duty of occupation. So a house in Scotland built in a rural area can be used as a second home, as a primary dwelling, as a short-term let, with very few planning controls to move between the two. There's no strict different use class differentiating them, although new controls have made it possible for local authorities to control short-term lets, properties like Airbnb, as opposed to second homes. So there's no different use class between a second home and a primary home in Scotland, and no particular legislation like Boplicht to control it. But crofting does this particular housing type does have a duty of occupation. So I want to just suggest that we need to be thinking about innovative solutions, not just for delivery, but also for regulation of the housing market in rural Scotland. And it's not just about scaling up delivery, but it's also about spreading out the agency of the people and the organisations that are able to deliver homes. It's not just about enabling big housing developers to do this work. It's about supporting and enabling local communities through our community wealth building agenda to do this too. A bit more about the national context. Now, this is similar to Julia's slide earlier, but I just want to emphasise this difference in second homes. So that on the surface, it looks like there's significantly less pressure likely in Scotland's rural housing market as caused by second home ownership in the countryside. But what these figures don't take into account is that many, many more properties in Scotland are actually rented out as short-term lets. And these second home numbers for Scotland don't include all of those properties that are being rented out to tourists. And I think I just want to stress that in Scotland, at least at a local level, the general perception is that whereas short-term let properties are considered to be beneficial economically, because we have over the whole year, most weeks of the year, these properties might be rented out for 1 or 2 weeks to families and individuals who come and spend money locally from outside. Second home ownership is looked at very differently, because often there isn't anyone living there for a huge part of the year, and they're just empty and sterile. There's no economic benefit directly from occupation of second homes, or not nearly as large as a private permanent dwelling house or a short-term let. In terms of the legal and political context, there's some real similarities with Norway, but one particular major difference. So we have a national planning framework called National Planning Framework 4. It's the 4th iteration. And in Scotland, planning legislation is a devolved power from the UK government, so we can control our own planning law. We also have regional authorities. We've got 32 local authorities, so about a tenth of the number of municipalities as there are in Norway, and they cover population sizes of up to 100, 200, 300,000 rather than 15,000. And there's 34 of them, 32 local authorities and 2 national park authorities, and they create their own what are known as local plans, but really they're regional plans, which take into account the national plan, but against which decision-making is made. So decision-making in Scotland is made at a regional level, not at the smaller municipality level that Ellen pointed out. It's authorities that are covering hundreds of thousands of people that make the decision, not just authorities that cover, say, 15,000. We do have inter-regional spatial strategies that can be developed. They can be self-organised between regional authorities, and we also have the ability for local communities to create their own local plans. But they can't be statutory. They can only try and influence the regional plan when it's created. So that's just a slightly different diagram. We've got the National Planning Framework, or NPF4, local development plans, confusingly titled regional development plans in reality, local place plans for neighbourhoods and towns, and regional spatial strategies. That's a couple of excerpts from our National Planning Policy Framework, which I'll mention later. In terms of rural housing issues, so as mentioned before, we've got concentrated patterns of private land ownership, unlike Norway. So huge swathes of our land are owned by, Scotland is one of the most, has the least number of landowners in terms of land ownership, the most highly concentrated patterns of land ownership in the whole of Europe. There are issues for key workers trying to find homes. So recently in Lochallin in Morven, where we have our case study, the harbour master, very important job, their family just couldn't find a home. It's just really, really tricky for them to do that. There are many vacant properties, many of which are derelict, but it's very expensive to renovate them. Construction costs are very high, and also construction costs for renovations are very high because there's still a VAT, there's still tax on that process. And there's popularity with owning second homes from across the whole of the UK. So obviously the UK's population is 80 million. So there's a bit more pressure for buying houses in Scotland for second home ownership. And as mentioned, we have no equivalent to boplicht for all tenure types in Scotland. So some of the planning responses recently, so NPF4, we have a new, just a couple of years ago, this was adopted, our new national framework. Policy 17, rural homes, has laid out a more positive environment than ever before for the ability for planning consent to be enabled for remote rural and rural housing. And you'll notice here in particular that there's a requirement for local development plans, regional development plans, we should call them, I think, to think about the inclusion of small-scale housing such as crofts and woodland crofts and the appropriate resettlement of previously inhabited areas. So it's a very positive policy context on the surface in the planning system now. So in terms of delivery, NPF4 is trying to help that, but also in terms of regulation, we now local authorities now have the power, if they want to designate an area where they can control short-term lettings, which would mean that every current dwelling house would, in those areas, they need to apply for planning permission or consent in order for a change of use to be able to use as a short-term let. That isn't strictly the case for anywhere outside those control areas. It's a matter of materiality and impact on amenity. So it's very easy at the moment in most places in Scotland to turn a house into a short-term let, but we're bringing in some controls to that. Now, I just want to turn to crofting. Before we go to the case study with Sam, I just need to explain for all of us what crofting actually is, because this is a type of agricultural land ownership and housing mechanism that is unique to Scotland. And Sam's going to talk a bit more about on the ground practice of that. But crofting, this is a very modern looking croft here, but crofting, what is it? Well, jokingly in Scotland, we often say it's a small piece of land surrounded by miles and miles of red tape. So there's a tricky legislative and policy framework around crofting, but it has been around since 1886. Crofting is a system of landholding unique to Scotland. It's an integral part of life in the Highlands and Islands. A croft is a small agricultural unit upon which a crofter very commonly resides. A croft is technically the land, not the house the crofter lives in. Crofts are usually rented, and they are often part of large estates where the landowner is the crofter's landlord. But it is possible for community groups to buy their large areas of land and establish community crofts rather than they being established on private landowners' land. And there are around 20,000 crofts all across the crofting counties. Sam herself, our other speaker today, lives in one. And you can see in the red area, the area of crofting that is in Scotland is designated as a crofting county. So that's the Highlands and the west coast of Scotland. There's more than 750,000 hectares of land in Scotland that's crofting tenure, and about 33,000 people live in crofting households. And it can deliver a wealth of benefits to crofting communities. So crofts range in size from less than half a hectare to more than 50 hectares, but the average is about 5. They may or may not have associated buildings or a house, but very, very commonly do for them to be sustainable. The minimum size for a new croft now is 3 hectares, and rent is fixed at an annual rate by the Crofting Commission. So what are the rights and responsibilities of a crofter under the Crofters Holding Act in 1886? So the rights, they have security of tenure, fair rents, compensation for permanent improvements, and actually the right to pass on their croft, sorry for the slide there, or the right to pass on their croft to their family should they die. But the responsibilities include a duty to be resident on or occupy the land or live within at most 32 kilometres. A duty not to neglect their croft, a duty to cultivate and maintain their croft or put it to another purposeful use. So as I say, that is a particular type of legislation that applies to only this tenure type of rural housing or rural land use, not any other tenure type of rural housing. It's just important to remember, though, that crofting is not a housing model per se, but rather the opportunity for housing is an important benefit of the model. Value adds 588 million GVA per year to the Scottish economy, supports around 30,000 jobs. It's particularly beneficial in establishing and maintaining regenerative agriculture, far more so in general than land that is otherwise devoted to industrial forestry. It has a significant benefit in terms of the sustainability and biodiversity of the lands upon which crofts are established to Scotland. It can address the challenges of rural depopulation and enhance our culture, and it enhances our cultural and environmental landscapes. That's from a report that was released this year by Bigger Economics. So a little bit about Morven. Where is Morven? Well, here is Norway, here is Scotland, and that red dot is on the west coast of Scotland. So a little bit of context there. Zooming in, you can see all the main cities of Scotland. You may be familiar with some of them, Edinburgh and Glasgow likely. So Morven's on the west coast in an area called Loch Arbour. It's geographically remote, despite being on the mainland. When you visit it, it feels like you're visiting an island because it is a peninsula. And it requires at least one ferry to get to, unless you drive from the south all the way around. That can be a very long journey, but the quickest route with a ferry is about 3.5 hours from Glasgow. Overview, so it's much more like the size of one of the smaller Norwegian municipalities. There's about 360 people there, and its area is around 480 square kilometres. So the population density is about 0.55, which is extremely low. Glasgow, for comparison, around about 650,000 people, so only in 176 square kilometres of land with a density of over 3,000. But important to note that before a historic period called the Highland Clearances, where many people moved to the States and were forced off their land by landowners, Morven itself contains 10 times as many people. So we've been experiencing over the last 100 years significant depopulation, and that decline needs to be reversed if we're to keep this sustainability of our areas, these kind of areas going. So Morven has 2 main settlements, 5 main land holdings. There's a whiskey distillery, there's forestry, aquaculture, fish farming, and a silica mine. The main settlement is Loch Allen, but most of the second homes are concentrated in the second village of Drimnin. So here's Drimnin at the north, which is a little village surrounded by the Drimnin estate. Raymore Croft, which is where Sam lives, is just down the coast. Mull is to the south. The main town is Loch Allen, surrounded by a lot of land owned by Forestry and Land Scotland. There's a couple of the other larger estates are Tornish and Culloden. I'm just going to show you a quick video. Great, thanks for playing that, Lucy. That's just a little set of images to see how beautiful and pretty the area is. Now, over the next 5 years, in terms of affordable housing, trying to respond to the pressures that we face, Highland Council, which controls is the planning authority for the local area, is also intending to build in their whole region around about 3,500 homes. But over the next 10 years, we know that we're going to need at least 10,000 homes in general. And in terms of affordable homes, Highland Council are only planning to build about 250 units in the region that Morven is in. So it may not be that they're able to address all of the need. In fact, it's very likely that that won't be able to happen. I'm just going to hand over to Sam now, who can root you in the story of Morven Community Woodlands' proposal to develop woodland crofts.
Hi everyone, and thank you, Paul. That was great. Yeah, so as you can hear, I'm not Scottish to start with, but I thought I'd just say a little bit about myself and my journey. I'm from London originally, but I moved to Scotland about nearly 20 years ago and moved to Knoydart from London, which is a community land-owned peninsula, and got. I think that's really shaped my approach to living in the Highlands of Scotland. So I've been in the Highlands for 20 years. So Morven itself, we've got quite a critical housing need. I mean, Paul mentioned the harbour master, but actually there's probably at least 4 or 5 jobs at the moment that either the development company or the mine or estates are trying to fill and finding it hard to fill because we don't have housing. You can see from this slide that the school, at the same time the school roll's falling, and a primary school forms like an essential part of the community. I think when we're all very aware who live here that when a primary school closes, lots of jobs go with it, and then we won't get any more families coming in. So the school roll has gone from when I arrived, the school roll was kind of about 25, and in 1998 it was 36, and it's gone down to 9 recently. In the 1950s there were 2 primary schools here, so it's a gradual decline. So the population is falling, but also it's becoming increasingly an aging population, which is an issue and will become an issue in the future. At the same time, there were and I've put there was recently a single bedroom house became available that the development company, which owns some buildings and a small amounts of land, which is a community run company, a single bedroom house became available, and we had 6 local applicants for that, which is a sign of the demand there is for housing. Just go to the next slide. So at the same time, there's also a lack of access to land. I know in the Norwegian case there was talk of like how many generations people are from agricultural lives, but actually probably in the Highlands in Loch Allen, a lot of the people who are from Loch Allen originally are probably only 1 or 2 generations away from agriculture, and a lot of them are keen to get back to having a relationship to the land, and as Paul said, there's a lack of access to the land. So most crofts are not woodland crofts. Most crofts are pastoral crofts, and our croft that we have is 60% woodland. It just happens to be that way, and 40% pasture. So actually a woodland croft is a relatively new concept, and basically a woodland croft is a croft with all the same crofting law applied to it, but a proportion of it is woodland cover, which is usually a minimum of 20%. And like all other woodland in Scotland, as well as all the crofting law that relates to ordinary croft, you also have you're expected to have a woodland management plan, and there's obligations you have to maintaining woodland or regenerating woodland and looking after woodland, depending on the type of woodland you have. So woodland management is part of the creation of woodland crofts. I spoke a little bit about Knoydart, but Knoydart was one of the second, well, it started with Aston, and then Egg and Knoydart were 2 of the first places to where communities exercised a right to buy the areas they're on. And Knoydart's quite a large peninsula, and it was due to absentee landowners. So these large landowners we're not looking after we're not looking after their tenants, etc., etc. And so we now have the Scottish community right to buy legislation where community bodies can purchase land, whether it's small amounts or large amounts, and assets, and that can be done independently of the Scottish Land Fund, but there's also the Scottish Land Fund, so there's a pot of money for communities to do that. There's also the Forest and Land Scotland, which own the kind of publicly owned forests in Scotland, have the Community Asset Transfer Scheme, which means that where a community requests to purchase a piece of land that is Scottish forestry, Forest and Land Scotland have to consider that request. So that means that there's been quite a lot of purchasing of community woodlands and community forests for like different uses. And there have also been communities who have decided to create crofts on land they've already purchased. They maybe purchased the land because of an absentee landowner to gain control over the land. And then they've created crofts, new crofts, or there have been existing crofts. But now, in recent years, there's been a few communities, and we're hoping to be one of those, where the community have bought land specifically from Forest and Land Scotland to create woodland crofts. Just go to the next slide. So I mean, and it's not just as Jamie McIntyre's quote said, it's not just about housing. It's about giving people the opportunity to create land-based businesses to boost the local economy. And the crofts create opportunities for people to build their own homes, as well as communities sometimes are building affordable homes that are related to the crofts. Part of the crofting system is that there are crofting grants. Those are both for agricultural activities, but there are also crofting housing grants, so that any new crofter will get a grant of about £38,000 to £48,000 to help them build their own property. So this is a way of particularly helping young people to potentially start doing self-build. And generally there is a recognition that because of the heritage of crofts, that that those houses are welcomed and accepted. There is because there's this new system or this new move for community bodies to create crofts on community owned land. There's kind of another layer of kind of legislation coming in, so that on top of the crofting legislation, so at the moment, if you own a croft, you can decroft a bit of your croft and sell it off, or you can decroft a bit of your croft and build a house on it and sell that off. But if the community own the land, there's a kind of combined legislation to stop that happening, so that the communities have some influence on what happens to any houses built on the crofts after they've been built. There's also, separate to the crofts, there are schemes such as shared equity building schemes where the community retain ownership in land, or rural housing burdens that give the right of buyback, a kind of preemptive right of buyback, which are other mechanisms whereby communities and community bodies, which is basically any constituted group with a set of articles that a democratic community body can do this, can retain. Can help people to build houses, and even build houses themselves. And our local development company has currently got plans for 10 houses, affordable houses, but then ensure those houses do not then enter into the second house market. Because as Paul said, where I am in Drimnin, a rough estimate from counting the houses is that about 60 to 70% of the houses here are second houses, which changes the dynamics substantially. But yeah, that's where we're at. It's already happening in Kilfinnan, Glengarry, Langamel, and Turoran, and as part of we've had funding to go and visit these summits. We've visited 3 of these different sites, and we've learned a huge amount from going to them. There are upsides and downsides. Sometimes those crofts are created on clear fell sites. There's a huge amount of work for the crofters to do, but we are very hopeful moving forward. Both Morven Community Woodlands, working with Morven Community Development Company, which is a large development company in the peninsula, that we can achieve what we want to, and buy about 150 hectares of land to create a series of crofts.
Great, thanks, Sam. So this is just a wee map zooming in even further to Morven. I'm just going to take 5 more minutes, if I may. So that's just north of Loch Allen. You can see the forest lands that the Community Woodland Group are intending on buying. And they're doing feasibility studies at the moment, but a key part of that will be securing planning consents for this land use change. Ideally before they buy the land, so that de-risks the situation, but also de-risks any future tenants coming onto the land, so that they know that they could build a house on that property. So some of the money is going to hopefully come through the community land fund, but the actual price of buying that land is going to be really, really significant. So there's a lot of work to do in multiple different ways there. But we have we are putting forward this land in planning terms to get planning permission in principle, hopefully through the local development plan creation process, by using this new mechanism of a local place plan that the community has been constructing. So I just want to come into land. In terms of planning and in terms of provocative questions, just to finish this talk, the first thing I want to say is that soon, as Sam and the Community Woodlands seek to gain planning consent for this proposal, we know from other locations that they're going to encounter some tricky planning issues. Now, to stress that NPF 4 is very positive in terms of its rural housing policy, 17, and it's also very positive about encouraging development that is linked to community wealth building and community ownership of land. But there are other policies that conflict, all for very good reasons. So, for example, Policy 6, Forestry, Woodland and Trees. Now, one of the issues, just to get a little bit technical for a minute, is that policy requires that where woodland is removed, compensatory planting will be required. And that's usually done by buying another piece of land and planting trees to compensate. That, in and of itself, that's not a problem. That's really good. However, for community groups, buying additional land for that purpose is going to be really, really expensive and potentially neutralize what they can do or stop them doing that. The actual policy for how compensatory planting is applied is the Control of Woodland Removal Policy, and it's actually at the moment a little bit of a barrier within the planning system, as far as we can tell, because in requiring compensatory planting, it requires it for any economic development, including tourism, renewables, and community projects like woodland crofts, but not for enhancing habitat, species, or landscapes. And this is rooted in some legislation from 2009 that's never been reviewed. And so it's looking like at the moment there's a danger that compensatory planting may be required even for houses that might be built on woodland crofts where we're trying to develop. Such houses in reality are actually maintenance infrastructure, but the planning system isn't certain how to think about those houses. You need them to really farm the land and to gain all the benefits of regenerative agriculture, but we can't. It's a tricky issue. So we need to look at how we can address that stuff. We need to look at how we can change those policies and that legislation to facilitate these buildings. And just as a provocation to finish with, a summary of our context. We've got historic legislation rooted in Scottish culture that ensures a duty of occupation for rural land. We've got second home ownership of all tenures that is distorting the market for homes for primary residence for local people. We can't get key workers for our wind turbine programme. Local people can't find homes to run their local harbours. Crofting, though, housing built on crofting land cannot become a second home, and Scottish planning policy already supports crofting and by extension the duty of occupation for crofts. We also now have local authorities who have the power to control short-term lets in particular areas, but we don't differentiate in our use class between primary and second homes, unlike Norway. And unlike Norway, where boplikt has been applied and is empowering communities for over 50 years, we don't have the ability to ensure that primary residences might be given elevation in the land market against second home ownership. So my question is basically, should we be looking at introducing a Scottish boplikt equivalent, expanding the kernel of that already exists for a long time in Scottish culture within crofting, applying that and expanding that kernel beyond crofts to other rural tenures? What would that look like? We could make sure that we have a different use class. Class 9 could be split so that we recognize second homes and primary dwellings as separate use classes, as in Norway. We could recognize the existing use of existing properties just now. So everyone who's got a second home, that's a second home. Everyone who's a primary dwelling, that's a primary dwelling. Then we could make it permitted development or not require planning permission to move from a second home to a primary dwelling. But we could require planning permission to go the other way, enabling local authorities to control it. And then we could assess future applications under these new definitions and ensure that primary dwellings are focused on and enabled. And potentially we could look at legislation like boplikt to enforce compulsory sale orders if required. So spread and scale, regulation and delivery. Can crofting make a difference? Can it be part of the solution? And do we need to look at some new regulations to look at a duty of occupation for Scottish rural housing? Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Paul. We've only got 15 minutes left, or just over. So I'm going to ask all the presenters to come back on the screen, including Gunnar, who's been working behind the scenes to help answer questions. Thank you very much for such an absolutely brilliant presentations. Really, really fascinating to compare the two countries. What's really struck me is that in Scotland, we have this critical housing need. We have this housing crisis. In Norway, not so much, although Ellen was saying that potentially, it's becoming a bit of an issue, but with the amount of land that Norway has and various discussions that we've been having before this presentation, it seems that, it's a much bigger issue within Scotland and within the UK generally. And of course, land ownership is different between the two countries. And before I move on to the questions that have been presented by various members of the audience, I'm wondering whether Gunnar or Ellen, whether you just want to come in just to explain a wee bit about land ownership within Norway, just in the context of what you've heard in Scotland.
Yep, I can make a start, and can
Great, thank you.
Add to it. In terms of the land ownership in rural areas, there are relatively large areas which are state-owned, various state organisations, but there are also large numbers that are privately owned, but we don't have the same pattern of large landowners that you have in Scotland. If you look at a map showing land ownership, you can see often in rural areas there are sort of strips of land up into the mountain which have the same landowner as people who own the what was a small holding down by the water down in the valley. So I would say that the land ownership pattern in general is quite different, albeit there's still quite a lot of private ownership, but it's split up into much smaller plots, so you don't have the same distribution.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else want to comment on that at all before we move on to another question?
I could just comment that the policy in Norway from the state has been that people should own their own homes, and that includes the ownership to the land. And as Ellen says, there is a lot of the structure of the land, the agricultural land is often that you have a property that runs from the river in the valley up through the fields and then up to the mountains where you would graze your sheep and cattle. And we also have a structure where you have certain rights on other people's property. So you could have the right to graze your cattle or collect firewood or collect water. So there's maybe a more complex system of ownership in Norway than in Scotland, but very many people own their own plots.
Okay, thank you. Interesting. I'm going to move on to a different question here that's been raised about do the planning policies in Norway try to restrict or prevent changes of use of coastal buildings to second homes? And if so, are they successful? Any thoughts on that from Gunnar and Ellen?
Well, yes, they try to control that, and especially in the popular areas along the south coast of Norway, it's a problem that the attractive houses are used as second homes. So boplikt is one of the ways that they're trying to control this. What happens if you're allowed to sell a dwelling as a second home that is close to the coastline, the price will maybe go up 30, 40, 50%. So local people will be practically prevented from buying it. So as Ellen said, there are some ways to try to circumvent the regulation, but the local people are often very conscious about who is actually using the houses as a second home and not.
Okay, interesting. And it is true that foreigners can't buy houses within Norway, is it? Or it was, and if that is correct, do you have less of a problem of homes being owned by people that aren't local or haven't got an interest in Norway itself?
Well, foreigners are allowed to buy homes in Norway, but being fairly expensive compared to other nations. I see. I haven't registered that is a big problem, but maybe you know something about this, Ellen.
Okay.
No, nothing to add there. It's not been a problem as far as I know. No.
Okay. A question here, is there a legal duty in Norway to give family members first refusal when selling land and property? Any comments on that?
You have to answer this, Ellen, because I don't really understand the question.
Right. Okay. I'm not sure, to be honest. The question is essentially whether, when you want to sell a property, whether you have to offer the property to relatives first to see if they would buy it before it then goes on the open market. I think there are probably rules and regulations in relation to farms. In fact, I'm pretty sure about that, but not for general residential or second homes, as far as I know.
No, the farms are a special case where the relatives have a right to take over the farms, but all other properties you can sell as you like.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so over to the Scottish presenters now. There are questions here about whether there's a political will within Highland to expand the short-term let control areas. So this presentation, it touched upon that briefly, and of course it comes into the housing debate, but it's whether, I guess, Sam, if you're on the ground, are you aware of the issue with short-term let issues in the Central Belt where there are controls, particularly in Edinburgh, and whether Highland is keen to adopt this. Sam, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, we've discussed it a bit. We've been working partly with Paul on the steering group for the local place plan, and it's, I think we're beyond that in Drimnin because of the second house issue being so critical. But in Loch Allen, the other settlement, I think people are quite keen to, certainly where there's areas of housing quite close together, that I think they're very aware of the change it creates when houses become short-term lets, and so people are quite keen to bring in restrictions and try and control what parts of the village become short-term lets. And I think there is an awareness that does those will take away from local houses, from houses that key workers can build and can live in just as much as the second houses do. Yes, they contribute to the economy, so that's something. So at least you still have your shops, but which you don't in Drimnin. There isn't even a shop, but obviously they take the housing stock away from houses people can live in, and that's the critical shortage at the moment. And they change communities. They change the way, if everyone's used to knowing all their neighbours and chatting with all their neighbours, and suddenly like 30% of those are people coming in and out, it changes the feel of the place. So yeah, I think people are aware of it and keen to consider it.
There's a question. Oh, sorry, Paul. Yeah, come in.
So Highland Council have applied a short-term let control area in the Badenoch and Strathspey area of the Highlands. So they have actually taken that step. There aren't too many other locations in Scotland where that's been applied. Edinburgh City, maybe a couple of other places, but many local authorities are considering this option as part of their local development plan process. For example, a very popular coastal town, North Berwick, which is not far from Edinburgh, that's being considered at the moment, and the community is putting that forward. My instinct is that kind of control will likely be mostly applied to particularly superheated areas where there is a significant amount of short-term let properties. And I'm talking, quite a high percentage. It's going to be less likely, I think, that local authorities would apply that at a sort of micro scale. And I think, at least in Morven, my take was that it's the second home issue that's the biggest issue, because they're quite sterile economically and socially. Like Sam says, at least the short-term let properties, at least they bring in people, presence, and a local economy.
Okay. Sam, have you had much dialogue with the Crofting Commission? There's been a question here about whether they could do more to help crofters.
In what sense? I mean, the Crofting Commission will help set up crofts, and I think they're quite open to setting up crofts. But obviously, there has to be the land to set the crofts up on, and we, as well as trying to purchase land, we have been and continue petitioning local landowners, because there's as many people want agricultural crofts as there are, particularly people who come from agricultural families. Who want woodland crofts, but landowners are quite obviously reticent to give up land. I mean, what's interesting is a lot of the young people who are wanting agricultural crofts, their families were brought to the area by the large landowners and lived in tied housing on those estates, and then have now moved into the village and are living with their parents in either rented or council housing. And so it's a two-pronged approach, but as I say, I think the Crofting Commission are quite open to creating crofts, but you have to have the land.
Yeah, okay, interesting. There was talk about compensatory forests that had to be planted within the Morven context. Given the amount of forestry land within Norway, do you have to provide compensatory forest land when you build on forests within Norway? Is that also an issue?
No, it's not an issue in Norway. What we're trying to do is prevent people from building on agricultural land or land that could be used as agricultural land. So the government or the state has tightened the amount of land that is allowed each year to be transferred to buildings or roads or infrastructure.
Whereas I wonder, maybe in Scotland, forestry land is like there's really good reasons to protect forestry land that came in a decade ago when wind turbines started to ramp up, because we were losing quite a lot of forest land. The problem is that there's this kind of focused issue around woodland crofts that means that the development of woodland crofts seems to be falling foul of the same policies, even though the benefits for being able to secure the potential for housing through the planning process, and the fact that that housing itself should, I think, be seen as a maintenance infrastructure, like a log pile, because it's so critical for that croft land to actually be used and maintained well, and in many cases to generate much better biodiversity. It seems a bit perverse that it's falling foul of an older policy that should have been reviewed like in 2014 in the planning process, where there's this requirement for compensatory planting for a house specifically on a croft, on a potential woodland croft. So I just think we need to look at that a little bit.
Yeah.
Can I just chip in? There's quite a lot of people.
Sure, Paul. Yeah.
Briefly, there's quite a lot of comments about effectively saying something like, I think mostly from possibly English practitioners, although I'm very open to learning in this area, but it's like people saying that a duty of occupation, is that not similar to a local or principal occupancy clause, which is definitely something that it seems is being applied in areas of, say, the Lake District in England, but it's just to provide a concept that Scottish planning is devolved, and at the moment, or at least from 2011, the Chief Planner's letter has significantly discouraged the use of occupancy clauses to try and control, because there are some potential unintended consequences. But I think that's the context, the housing crisis context has changed significantly in the last 13 to 14 years. Whether we revisit that or we look at some of the suggestions I made around learning more from the Norwegian system, I do think that that's something that is overdue, and that we need to look at regulation, not just more delivery.
Yeah. Thanks, Paul. I think that there's this huge debate, isn't there, within Norway and Scotland, and I'm sure worldwide, just about the difference between national policy and local policy, and how much influence does national policy have. How, I guess, in the Scottish context, how much does the Scottish government interfere, I guess, with local issues? And it's something that, you know, that I guess with NPF4, the National Planning Framework 4, now becoming part of the development plan, I guess some would say that in Scotland there is more national influence over local issues. The fact in Norway that you have so many local authorities covering small numbers of people, actually there is so much local control, and I guess that's got pluses and minuses, and Ellen highlighted that in terms of perhaps there's a need for national policy to try and influence what's happening in terms of the cabins and second homes, but it's often difficult to do that, or they're reluctant to do that because of local power and so on. So I think that these tensions will always exist, but I think where we can learn from other places, and that's what we've been doing today. And the fact that the National Planning Framework 4 is trying to positively encourage rural housing. The fact that Norway has, to some extent, now has suburban cabin estates within the countryside with question mark environmental and sustainability concerns. I think that we do need to be careful about how we expand rural Scotland. But I think there's definitely lessons that could be learned, and perhaps picking up on the point about use classes, which is very relevant in Scotland just now because of the fact that we now need planning permission for a change of use to short-term lets. So that's become a different use class. I'm just wondering whether we can end the seminar with a quick poll. Lucy, if you're around, it is bang on 2:00, but just a really quick poll to ask the audience whether you believe that having a separate use class for second homes may to some extent help solve the problem of second homes within rural areas. Lucy, is that something that might be possible, or is it a bit too late? Perhaps Lucy's gone. Well, look,
I'm quite tight.
I think it's tight, and I think we're all probably ready for lunch. But look, we'll probably end it there. There's been lots of questions. Thanks, Paul, for bringing up the questions that had been raised from our English colleagues. I'd just like to end really by saying thank you so much for joining us today and for your questions. Thank you to our speakers and for this opportunity to take part in the 75th World Town Planning Day celebration. The session has been recorded. I know that some of you weren't able to see the video. That's no problem. We will make sure that is posted on the RTPI YouTube channel for you to look at again and to share along with the presenters' presentations. Don't forget to look out for further international events in RTPI generally, and also by RTPI Scotland, by the RTPI website. If you'd like to contact any of our speakers, please do get in touch via RTPI Scotland or contact the speakers directly. I'll just put up a final slide with their contact email addresses. Just before I do that, just to say happy World Town Planning Day, and bye for now.